Hello, my name's Jack Leeming. I'm one of the editors at Nature Careers, and I'm here with John Tregoning over at Imperial. John, it appears you're in your office today, as far as I can tell.
Yes, I'm at Imperial. So my name's John Tregoning. I'm an academic. I work at Imperial College in Paddington. I'm also a parent, and I have done some writing as well on the side. So I guess that's one of the things we're here to talk about, because I write for Jack quite often.
Yeah.
So Jack, where do you want to start? How did you get into Nature Careers?
How did I get into Nature Careers? About 5 years ago, I applied for this job and got it. And since then, the job itself has changed an awful lot. It used to be called Nature Jobs, for instance, as you remember, John. And we used to run on a terrible WordPress blog, and we've slowly professionalized a little bit and been brought into a folder Nature. But how I got this job, at the time, I was I basically just graduated. I'd done a bit of writing work and editing work and things like that, but I had just graduated from a master's degree, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think that helped a lot, because I was to some extent my audience. Do you know what I mean? Like we cater to PhD students and postdocs who often don't quite know what they're planning to do in their futures and what they'd like to, how they'd like to progress their careers. And I think that was kind of me. So I think maybe the people who hired me felt that that was a nice, a sensible way to start, or a sensible person to recruit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and what's it like working at my experience is basically only ever working in academia. What's it like working in a not academia situation?
Well, I think you're doing yourself a disservice there, because you write an awful lot for us, right? And you do a lot of stuff outside of the general academy.
Yeah.
I mean, I can only speak to my own experience, and I'm not sure. I think Nature's so allied to academia and science in lots of other ways, but I think we end up thinking quite a lot about the academy in ways that other industry positions might not, or other places outside of academia. But what would I say? It's a lot less transient, I think. I'm not on like a 2-year postdoc or a kind of limited degree program. I have less, I have goals that I need to meet, obviously, but I have less kind of important stepping stones in my career. It's a little bit less defined. I think it's more about just churning out the next article, if that makes sense.
And how does it work in terms, because you report in to somebody, you've got a next level up editor, and
yeah, that's right.
How many layers are there until you kind of?
How many layers of editors?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't done this in a while, but it's quite funny. We've got this internal system where it's like a really rubbish version of social media, where you can see how many levels up away you are from our esteemed CEO. I haven't done it in a while. 6, 7, 8, maybe. I've got, my editor has an editor, and then that's it, I think. And then we go into other kind of roles, I think. But yeah, you're right. And John, you would have had a lot of experience of being multi-edited by us at Nature, which is that unusual in your experience?
So yes, I think one of the things is really different in writing for the front or the back of Nature compared to the middle is the role of the editor. So
I think you should explain that from
I might have to explain that. So I'm talking about Nature as when it used to be a paper journal, which it probably still is vaguely, but it has 3 broad bits to it. It has news at the front, it has the science in the middle, and then it has careers at the back. That's roughly, and the front and the back section are directly curated and edited, whereas the middle bits are the kind of more traditional for a science writing, or science is you basically submit papers and they get edited in the way that a scientist might understand that. So I think if we split those 2 bits for a moment, if we're talking, if you're a PhD and a PhD postdoc, you're probably used to the process where you submit a paper, the editor chooses whether to accept it, it then goes to review, and it goes through that process. Whereas the process with Jack is much more editorial in the newspaper style of the word, whereas I write something, then send him a draft. he then scribbles all over it and tells me some bits work, some bits don't, some bits get quite big red crosses through them. We then go through another iteration where it goes to another editor who then tells Jack that what he said on my stuff is wrong. And then I think we only normally have 2 rounds. We don't often go up beyond that, but it's very different. It's a much more active process. I actually find it's a much more constructive process than the science paper editing, where you're tending just to get a yes or a no. This is really sort of steers it, it tightens up the language. It helps me express my ideas better. So it's a nicer writing approach, personally, I find.
That's interesting. So you find getting a primary research paper published to be more of a squeeze, more of just a try to get this thing into a journal as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so
it doesn't really matter.
Academic editors are, and they're pretty, but primarily gatekeepers, and choose what papers will go through onto the next to the review. Whereas then they may make suggestions and they'll have a bigger overview, but it's not kind of line by line editing in quite the same way. And maybe because they're probably bigger pieces of work. I mean, we're writing 700 to 1,000 words, and a paper's 5,000 with figures, but it's a completely different process. And it's a really interesting, it's a good process to go through, because it has helped me, my grammar and my language is better because of going through this process and kind of learning on the job.
We should explain what you're writing for me, probably.
So yes, so I maybe I'll do my path to the not talking about the academic side, but the writing side. I wrote to Jack's predecessor, Julie. I guess she was, yeah. And I basically wrote to her and said, "Oh, I'd like to write for your magazine. How do I do that?" And she came back and said, "This is not the way you approach people, but here's some ideas." And I wrote a couple of articles for her. And then early this year, I guess I approached you. We started talking about writing these coronavirus diaries.
Yeah, I can't remember who approached who, but yeah, certainly the idea was born out that, I mean, what I wanted to do was find a different way to cover coronavirus that felt appropriate and was reflective of a lot of scientists' experience. I mean, as you can imagine, once lockdown started happening and no one knew what happened, and everyone started panicking and freaked out by it all, we wanted to find a way to reflect the scientific experience in that. And whilst we do publish columns and we publish, personal views of people, that isn't always consistent, and it's kind of difficult to get a handle on what someone might be going through throughout the whole process, So the idea of coronavirus diaries was born out, as you say, John. We worked together before. I think it helped we're in the same time zone, because we wanted to get these out really, really quickly, once a week at first.
Yep.
You ticked our box as well. I mean, again, you were used to writing for us. You're in a position, you're like an academic position in your career, where I think a lot of people, you're not quite in the middle. You're above middle career, but you're relatable, I suppose, in an academic perspective. And you write an awful lot about academic careers anyway, so you know what it's like, and you've thought about that in depth. So that's, I think, why we asked you to do these diaries for us, and because you're up for it.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, once a week we started publishing your personal experience during coronavirus, which is unusual. We've never done anything like that before.
And it was an interesting challenge, because we were writing. We always had like 3. You had to have an idea. I had to have an idea in my head, an idea that was working on, and an idea that you're editing at anyone, because it was such quick turnaround. We had like multiple things. It was like planes stacked up above Heathrow. There was always kind of something further back. I had a whiteboard in the office that was kind of had the ideas that I was kind of working towards. But it was an interesting process of trying to produce that much material in quite a short time.
I think it's really hard to write a column at once a week. And you see things on like normal newspaper magazines, like there's often the back page of like a Saturday magazine will have like a person's weekly column, and most of the time it's almost about nothing. Do you know what I mean? Like it's kind of just like, oh, here's a day in my life with kids and family, and and making that entertaining and engaging and worth reading, I think, is a real challenge. I mean, how have you found it? Was it as difficult as I just made it out to be, or
I wouldn't be able to sustain it. And I think the change in circumstances of having a slightly different, like not having the lab or not having to come in, there was a slightly, like time was pressed, but in a different way to normal. And it meant I had a different kind of space in my week to think in a different way. I would find it very hard to sustain doing that and thinking up grants, and it uses kind of a lot of the creative space that I need to do the science as well. So I really enjoyed it. I would find it hard to do sustainably going forward.
And you had something to write about every week, right? It was about coronavirus. It wasn't just about your life. If it was just like a day in the scientist's life every week for ad infinitum, I think that would be really, really difficult.
And it changed, and like you said, it changed. Like the situation was constantly changing, so there were new challenges and new things to think about. But yeah, it was interesting. And then in terms of what and thinking more in general about your career, you've curated 5 years worth of career advice. What are the things that have sprung out to you over those? What piece of advice have come out to you from the articles that you think that this has really resonated with me, or what's the most downloaded article you've ever had?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the most popular article we've ever done is a superb piece called 20 Things I Wish I Knew About My PhD, which is lovely. A quite simple piece of advice. I mean, statistically speaking, some of the people watching this would have read that. Whenever I give a talk, back when I used to give talks live in front of an audience, I'd ask everyone to stick their hand up if they've seen that piece, and most of the room had, invariably, which is nice. That's really rewarding. That's properly impactful. But yeah, that's a great piece, and I'd encourage people to seek out. But it's a lot of things about kind of the stress and pressures of a PhD, and whilst it isn't necessarily damning of the PhD process, I wouldn't say it's entirely positive. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like the happiest article we've ever published. I mean, one of our runner-up most populars, I can't remember the exact title now, but I found it interesting. It also has the word wish in it. It was kind of what I wish I'd done, or no, what I wish my family knew, my friends and family knew about my PhD, I think is what it's called. And I found it very interesting. They've both got wish in it. It's quite a passive verb, wish. It's not something you can action, which is unusual for us, because I think most of the time we try to publish stuff, as you know, John, that talks about what people can do, how you can take control of your situation, how you can kind of action yourself and the world around you to better improve your career. So wish felt out of place in that, because that's an admission that you can't change or action or do something. It's a suggestion, but it's kind of out of your hands, and you pray to some higher power that things will change in some way. So that was interesting. And that points, I suspect, to one of the things that's really borne out over those 5 years of reporting on scientific careers is that academia is pretty rubbish for an awful lot of people, especially early career researchers. I think they're not necessarily given, or they certainly don't feel they have the tools to go on out of academia and do something else.
Yeah, and I think that's a shame. I think that's maybe a misapprehension. I think one of the images I like to think about or talk about is that there's a sort of survivor bias in academia, that there's two images. There's the one of the aeroplane, the analysis of the aeroplane with the bullet holes in it. I don't know if you've seen it. So there's an aeroplane, and they were analyzing the patterns of where the bullet holes hit on the aeroplane. And it showed, and they were like, well, okay, and it's not that the bullet holes hit there and that's a bad place to put more armor. It's actually the bullets where it doesn't hit, where there's no holes, the plane blows up. And in academia, the model often PhD students, I think you can the trap can be fall into, is the people you see who are successful, and in inverted commas, are the next level up. They're the PI. So you don't see all the other people who are successful who go off into jobs and into other companies, or, you know, like Sean set up their own company. There's lots of jobs out there, but it's a kind of weird survivor bias that the only people you see in academia are academics. So I think it's not, you know, there's not a single mountain. There's loads of mountain ranges out there to go off and do. It's just getting exposure to these other things. My advice is always, you know, go and look around the world outside. I think you can get really trapped in the PhD, and I personally kind of got to the end of mine and thought, no, I'm never doing science again, I'm quit, and it took a while to kind of readjust back after that. So it is a tricky time, but it doesn't need to be. And I think reaching out for support and finding networks is really important in that kind of stage, and knowing that, yeah, and knowing that it does, you know, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's a training in science. It's not a training in academia. I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm not. I think if everyone realised that, then academia would be a healthier place. But it is a training in science, not in academia. And that a PhD prepares you for a world outside of academia as well as inside. Yeah, and you're totally right about the survivor bias. Like, I think, yeah, people see leaving academia as somehow dying or just disappearing off the face of the earth, and you know, someone who holds a PhD or a postdoc and is clearly intelligent and excels and has that higher level degree because it's a certificate of applied intelligence, because they're able to show that they are clever. They're not about to leave academia and suddenly become homeless, like looking for. Do you know what I mean? Like that's not what happens. They go on to have good, positive careers elsewhere outside of the academy, and they're not necessarily just become nothing, jump ship, and
yeah. I think I get, you know, you get to see it through all the people who kind of communicate about their careers to you, and I get to see it through my peers. The people I did PhDs with aren't all academics now, but they're happy and they're successful and they're doing lots of different things. So I think it's maybe a little bit of a bunker mentality that everyone you're surrounded with is going through this challenging experience, but you're not seeing, you know, you can't see 10 years down the track where everyone will be in different roles. So yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, I certainly wasn't happy for my whole PhD. I don't think anyone is. It's also a transition, right? It's a transition from being an undergrad where you just don't do very much to having a first-time job. And there's a big kind of mindset change in that as well. So I think there's a lot of things that go on about in that space. That's
true. Now I think about it, your survivorship bias plane metaphor doesn't quite work, because it implies that.
I'll send Sean the image, and then he can hold it up in the right place.
But I just mean, you know, those soaring PhD students getting shot at. I mean, like the ones that fall and plunge into the ocean, presumably in your metaphor, are the ones who leave academia, which is not what we're trying to say.
No, it's not that. Yeah, no, it's I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say that if you analyze the patterns of who's left in it, and you assume that the only ones left are the survivors, then you're taking the wrong message out of your data.
Right.
What I'm saying is that, you know, there's lots of exit routes from it, and actually we need to say all of these exit routes are equally interesting and valid. And I think that's true at PhD and at postdoc. Like postdocs, it also isn't a route to academia. You know, it's a route, it's further training, and it's a job. There's a lot to be said for having a job, and, you know, perhaps, you know, if you see the PhD as an apprenticeship, the postdoc is like doing the actual role. And I took satisfaction in doing the science itself better as a postdoc than I did as a PhD, and not necessarily as a stepping stone to the next thing.
See, that's where I'm less sure, to be honest. I think with postdocs, I've spoken to a lot of scientists who feel like they were trapped after they had a postdoc, and they kind of gambled on getting through into academia, and that's kind of what a postdoc is an admission. But you definitely do want to go into academia, and then, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it's still a job. It's a way to be gainfully employed while you work out your options. But I think some of them felt that they could have been earning more money and getting better experience elsewhere outside of academia at that point, and then getting a postdoc was a mistake.
I was having a discussion on Friday. I mean, the money thing, yes, But you know, if you're say you finished your PhD even at 30, which is probably a bit late, you've still got 40 years of career space in front of you. So if you then take another 5 years out to do a postdoc, that's still 35. That's your whole life again. You know, you can retrain 4 times and still have meaningful careers. So I think, you know, small loss of earnings, I really don't. I do object to the idea that it's about the, you know, oh, I should have swapped to the city 5 years ago, and then it doesn't ring true really. I think if you want, you've got to try it. If you're passionate enough about science in the first place to do a PhD, then the postdoc I don't think is a waste.
Well, I mean, it does also, of course, depend on personal circumstance. You know, and it's not just the city or bust. It's middle.
Yeah, no, I don't want to belittle the experience. I just think it's the kind of, there is a, what am I trying to say? And it's really hard to say without an audience, but it's like you can get into like a negative spiral of the whole thing. And it's like, this is bad. I've lost my way. And that's not going to help in the long run bounce back into the next step. I think it's just step back. I think the most neutral advice is to step back and see where you've come and assess your journey, as much as kind of worrying about the next step. And the advantage I guess I have now is that I don't have a single strand of science that has to work for my kind of career happiness. So the PhD, you've got your project and it has to work, and you're happy when it's working and you're sad when it's not. And if you're a PI, you've got 5 people working on 5 different projects, and they all can be going at different speeds. But my kind of personal satisfaction isn't dependent on one experiment working at any one time. So I've sort of I get to de-risk a bit of that kind of fickleness of science, which is a really challenging part of science.
Yeah,
but that's not very helpful if you don't. It's just saying that's where I can take this sort of more Zen-like approach.
Well, I quite like that. I've never actually thought about that before. Kind of like building a portfolio, a risk management portfolio, I think would be the investment term, right? Something like that.
And I think you can do that as a peer. You know, you can do it as a student. You'll have high risk and low risk projects. It's always worth having multiple strands to stuff, because you never know what's going to work.
So, but on your science and career and stuff, you work in. I've been meaning to ask you this for a while, so I'm going to do it live in front of on a public forum, which is fun. You work in immunology research for the lungs, right, or for respiratory diseases?
Yeah.
But you've been working a little bit on coronavirus, but you've been very careful to play it down whenever I ask you about it.
Yes, yeah, so I've not been working on the. So my experience of it was I haven't done any direct research on coronavirus. I've done a small amount of work on a vaccine, a candidate platform that's similar to one that's going forward. So I've done some work on that, but not directly on the virus itself.
Okay.
And I guess you're asking why or why not, and I get the answer.
No. Well, my question isn't that, but that is an interesting question, so I'll add that on. But my question is: have you noticed? I wonder if there's. I mean, I looked at. Sorry, I'm going to add some context to this question. I looked at archive and all the other kind of med archive and all those preprint things quite early on in the coronavirus, in kind of March, April, and the amount of stuff that was being just poured out, which mentioned the coronavirus, which clearly was a bit people were maybe I'm taking advantage, a bit harsh, but people were clearly adding the word coronavirus into their work and hoping it would get some traction. And they were probably, it probably worked for an awful lot of people. My question isn't, are you doing that cynical publishing? But my question is there more money sloshing around in immunology respiratory diseases at the moment? Have you noticed? Or
I haven't noticed. I haven't been looking. I think that, there's some of the kind of emergency money that's gone into it, but whether that's new money or that's just been pulled out of something else. I think what it may help with is making a case for doing this area of research versus, say, if there's a limited pie, it may pull a bit more towards infection research than cancer or neuroscience or so. So it may change the shape of the pie or the split of the pie going forward. But unfortunately, nobody's just turned up with a bag of cash and said,
well, yeah, I mean, that's why I want
get on it. And that's a shame.
And then, yeah, the other question around whether or not, why or why not have you, has it been a conscious decision to not focus on coronavirus?
No, I think what it came down to is resources and flexibility. I think if you look at the groups that have been able to make the big shift into it this year, they were much bigger groups. They were very well established, and they had some spare capacity of staff to switch over projects quite early on and then move that round. And so they were able to. I have a smaller team, and they had their own projects, and to throw that out and move it. And it comes down to like be able to use high containment labs, which I don't necessarily have access to either. So there's a bit of kind of availability and access, and I think that made it harder to kind of move over. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's lots of. I mean, there's so much fascinating questions about it. I'm interested to go. There's lots to be done.
Yeah, I mean, we pivoted to cover, like as you might expect, like every career is influenced by it, every lamp shuttered by it. It's all anyone was thinking about. So we pivoted in a way we've never had before to cover coronavirus in nature news in general, and nature careers, in particular. It was really interesting just covering it. I mean, it felt at times a little bit suffocating from my personal perspective, because you're trapped inside, you're thinking about coronavirus all the time anyway, and you're working on it all the time and editing people about their experiences. So I got a bit sick of it pretty quickly, to be honest, in some ways. But it was an interesting experience pivoting towards it from a journalistic perspective, and something I've never done before.
And then just to wrap up, what would be your one, if people wanted to come and write for you, what would a tip for aspiring writers for nature careers be?
Read all the nature careers articles we published, and then refresh them a few times to get our click rate up, which would be helpful. But no, in particular, there's I think if folks Google, let me get it up now, share your science career story in Nature, there is an article I wrote a year ago now, encouraging people to, giving some specific advice on how people can pitch us and what to say and that kind of thing. What we look for is, as you know, John, I mean, you've done it for us loads now, but what we look for is personal experience allied to help and advice. We don't want people to be patronizing or dogmatic in the advice they give people, and that's why the personal experience really, really matters. So you say, I went through this particular thing, whether that's like dealing with a gap in your CV, or having some kind of mental health difficulty, or struggling to manage your time well, or whatever it is. If you talk about that personal experience, that individual side of your world, and then include help and advice on how to deal with it, I think that's what generally we look for, which isn't a million miles away from primary research publishing, right? You do an experiment, you find results, and then you publish it and hope that other people can kind of build on those results. Don't have to repeat that same mistake or repeat that same experiment. Do you know what I mean? Does that work as a parallel?
Yeah, I think so. I think sometimes we separate our brains into, the tools we build up in one set of our lives, we don't always apply to the other. And I think that's really important to kind of spread, what I've learned, what you learn in one part, to put it into another part and kind of rebalance from that.
Right. And it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot. It's easy to say the word tool, but often when you're talking about things like mental health or time management, stuff like that, that there's not as defined a tool as something like CRISPR, right? Which is so clearly definable as like a specific thing. But I do think there are techniques and tools and ways to think about your career and personal life that can be boiled down to like tools or things you can use in some way. And John, one last question for you. I know you've written before about an acronym that's JDFI. Would you mind telling us what that means, ASAFP?
So it's one that came from when I was in the army. So I was a reserve officer for 10 years, which, you know, different story, but it kind of trained me in some of the management stuff that I think we don't always get in a straightforward academic career. And it is obviously just, you know, just do it. And I one time I was having a conversation with one of my students, and we were discussing the way to do a certain protocol. She thought one thing, I thought another. I was in a bit of a rush, and I suggested this approach to do the protocol. She didn't speak to me for a week. She's kind of forgiven me now, but it was, so as a management tool, I would not recommend it. But as a motivational tool for yourself, actually just getting on, doing stuff. There's the thing about, you know, there's a perfect thesis and there's a completed thesis, and they're two different things. And actually, I think maybe some of the writing I was doing with you, you know, it wasn't a perfect version that I ever sent to you. Some of them were certainly well short of perfect, but you know, getting that first draft done, just getting it onto the page and getting it out there is better than agonizing over that perfect phrase. And especially when the perfect phrase that I think, or the great joke about Game of Thrones that I try to sneak in, I think is brilliant, and then you eventually cut out anyhow. So you know, the thing that you could be agonizing over is not the next layer up once anyhow. So yeah, just getting on, doing it, and kind of accepting that you're never going to be perfect in what you're writing or doing. So
right. Yeah. I mean, the joke was okay.
It's just quite niche.
But I see we probably should go. So, John, it's nice chatting to you. Nice having a little chinwag in front of a virtual audience.
Thank you. And you,
yeah,
Jack.
nice catching up.